An orphan forced to marry a beggar who controls the entire city. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? How can a beggar control anything, let alone an entire city? But what you're about to discover will turn everything you think you know upside down. She stood there, at the door of the small wooden house she called home, gazing at the worn-out dress they had given her for the wedding. A second-hand dress, patched so many times it barely looked white. Her hands trembled as she held the faded fabric. 23 years of life, and all she had was shame. Sarah grew up knowing exactly what it meant to have no one. Her parents died when she was just 5 years old, victims of a fever that swept through the village like fire through a dry field. She was passed from family to family like a burden no one wanted to carry. She slept in barns, ate scraps, wore clothes other children had discarded. But the hunger wasn't the worst part. It wasn't the cold on winter nights when the wind cut through the cracks in the old wood. The worst were the stares, the way people would avert their eyes when she passed, as if the mere sight of her could contaminate their perfect lives. The other girls in the village had grown up playing together, sharing secrets, dreaming of their future husbands. Sarah grew up hearing whispers. Poor thing, what a tragedy. No one will ever want to marry her. The words were like tiny knives, carving away a piece of her dignity each time they were spoken. And they were right, or at least she thought they were. At 18, while her peers began receiving marriage proposals from young merchants and farmers, Sarah continued working in the fields. Her hands grew rough, her skin burned by the sun. She became invisible, a shadow on the periphery of village life. Years passed, 20, 21, 22. With each passing birthday without a proposal, the whispers grew louder. She'll die alone. She's past her prime. What a waste. Sarah learned to build walls around her heart. She stopped dreaming of white dresses and beautiful ceremonies. Stopped imagining what it would be like to have someone choose her, want her, see value in her. It was easier to feel nothing than to feel the constant pain of rejection. But then, 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Margaret appeared at the door of the small cottage where Sarah lived. Mrs. Margaret was the village matchmaker, a stout woman with keen eyes that could assess a young woman's marriage value in seconds. She had never visited Sarah before. Why would she? Sarah had no dowry, no family, nothing to offer. "I've found a husband for you," Mrs. Margaret had announced bluntly, as if commenting on the weather. Sarah's heart had leaped. For a second, a single second of painful hope, she had allowed herself to imagine. Perhaps there was a widowed farmer who needed help. Perhaps an older merchant who wanted companionship. Perhaps, just perhaps, someone finally wanted her. Who? She had asked, hating how small and hopeful her voice sounded. Mrs. Margaret had hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Sarah should have known. She should have understood that any pause before revealing a groom's name was a bad sign. "Robert," Mrs. Margaret had finally said. Sarah had blinked, confused. She didn't know anyone by that name. "Who is Robert?" "The beggar who stays near the market." The words fell like stones into a calm lake, creating shockwaves that spread throughout her body. The beggar. They wanted her to marry the beggar. "You can't be serious," Sarah had whispered. But Mrs. Margaret was completely serious. "Your aunt decided. She said you've been eating her bread for too long. It's time for you to become someone else's problem." Problem. That's what she was. Not a niece, not a person. A problem to be solved. "But he's a beggar," Sarah had protested, hating the desperation in her own voice. "He has no home, no money, no nothing." "And you think you have something better?" Mrs. Margaret had retorted. "You're 23, with no family, no dowry, no prospects. Be grateful someone is willing to take you, even if he's a beggar." The truth of those words had burned more than any insult. Because she was right. Sarah had nothing. She was nothing. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to find a way out. She went to her aunt, the woman who had taken her in after the last foster family had kicked her out at 15. "Please," she had pleaded, "don't make me marry him. I'll work harder. I'll eat less. Just don't force me into this." Her aunt had looked at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Do you think I keep you here out of kindness? You eat my food, use my space, and give me what in return? Shame. People laugh at me for keeping an unmarried niece. At least if you marry, you won't be my responsibility anymore. But a beggar. A beggar is better than nothing," her aunt had cut in. "And it's all you're going to get. Now get out of my sight. The wedding is next week." Sarah had tried to speak with the village chief, but he had only shaken his head with pity. "It's a family matter, Sarah. I cannot interfere." She had tried to speak with the other women, but they had only whispered among themselves when she approached. Some glances were of pity, others of secret relief. At least it wasn't them being forced to marry a beggar. And Robert. Sarah knew him by sight, of course. Everyone in the village knew the beggar who stayed near the market. He was a constant figure, always sitting in the same corner, his begging bowl in front of him, his clothes torn and dirty. But Sarah had never truly looked at him, She had never thought of him as a real person with a real story. He was just part of the scenery, like the cobblestones or the market stalls. Now she looked, and what she saw filled her with despair. Robert seemed to be around 30, perhaps more, perhaps less. It was hard to tell under all that grime. His hair was long and matted, his beard disheveled and full of food scraps. His clothes were literal rags, patched with mismatched pieces of cloth. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't verbally beg for alms as other beggars did. He just sat there day after day with that outstretched bowl. Some people threw coins. Most walked right past. This would be her husband. This dirty, silent, broken man would be the person with whom she would share her life. The shame Sarah had felt her entire life was multiplied 1,000-fold. She had thought she had hit rock bottom when she was passed from family to family. She had thought she had reached her lowest point when she became known as the orphan nobody wanted. But this was a new level of humiliation. The villagers were already talking. Of course they were. Gossip spread like disease in small places. Did you hear? The orphan is marrying the beggar. A perfect match, don't you think? The two village outcasts together. At least he's taking her off our hands. Sarah heard the whispers. She saw the thinly veiled looks of superiority. The other young women, those who had married respectable farmers and merchants, looked at her with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Their lives might not be perfect, but at least they weren't marrying a beggar. The night before the wedding, Sarah lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling of the small cottage. Silent tears streamed down her face, soaking the worn pillow. She thought about running away. She could leave in the middle of the night, walk to the next town, start over. But start as what? She had no special skills, no formal education, no money. She would probably end up on the streets, perhaps even worse off than a beggar. At least by marrying Robert, she would have. What exactly? A husband who couldn't provide anything? A life of begging beside him? The constant shame of being known as the beggar's wife? But perhaps, just perhaps, she would have someone. Even if he was just a dirty, silent beggar, he would be someone who legally belonged to her. Someone who couldn't simply send her away. It was a pathetic consolation, but it was all she had. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and cold. Fitting, Sarah thought bitterly as she put on the worn dress her aunt had thrown at her. There would be no elaborate ceremony, no banquet, no celebration. Just a quick visit to the church, a few words from the local vicar, and that was it. She would be married. Her aunt didn't even bother to accompany her. Find your own way to the church, she had said that morning. And after that, you're not coming back here. You're his problem now. Sarah walked alone through the village streets. Each step felt heavier than the last. People stopped to stare. Some laughed behind their hands. Others just shook their heads. When she arrived at the church, Robert was already there. And for the first time, Sarah truly, genuinely looked at the man who would be her husband. He was still dirty, still wearing rags, but there was something different. He was standing, not hunched over as she always saw him at the market. And when he raised his eyes to look at her, Sarah saw something that caught her completely by surprise. His eyes were clear, not clouded by drink or madness as she had expected. Clear, calm, and incredibly focused. For a moment, just a moment, she felt something strange. Not hope exactly, but perhaps a small crack in the wall of despair she had built. The vicar began the ceremony. The words washed over Sarah like water, meaningless and distant. She repeated the vows when asked, her voice barely audible. Robert spoke for the first time she had ever heard. His voice was surprisingly deep and firm. I accept. 2 simple words, but the way he said them, with such certainty, as if this were a choice he was actively making rather than something being forced upon him, made Sarah look at him again. He was watching her. Not with lust or despair or pity, just watching as if memorizing every detail of her face. The vicar declared them married. There was no kiss. There was no applause. Just the heavy silence of the empty church and the distant sound of village life continuing unconcerned. Let's go, Robert said calmly, and began to walk out of the church. Sarah followed him, because what else could she do? She was his wife now. For better or worse, and clearly it would be for worse, she belonged to this beggar. They walked in silence through the streets. Sarah expected him to lead her to some dirty alley or makeshift shelter where beggars slept. Her stomach churned at the thought. But Robert didn't turn towards the village's poor alleys. Instead, he kept walking, out of the village completely, towards the road that led to the hills. Where are we going? Sarah finally asked, her voice sounding strange after so much silence. Home, Robert replied simply. Home? What kind of home could a beggar possibly have? They walked for almost an hour. Sarah was used to physical labor, but even so, her legs began to ache. She wanted to complain, to ask how much farther, but pride kept her silent. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her weak. Then they rounded a bend in the road and Sarah stopped abruptly. Ahead, nestled against the hillside, stood gates. Large, intricately carved iron gates, beautifully adorned with ornate scrollwork and stone pillars. The kind of gates that guarded the estates of the wealthy. Robert continued walking towards them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Wait," Sarah said, confusion filling her voice. "You can't just—" But then the gates began to open. 2 guards appeared, dressed in clean, well-fitted uniforms. When they saw Robert, they immediately bowed deeply. "Welcome home, Mr. Sterling," one of them said with profound respect. "Mr. Sterling?" Sarah looked at the guards, then at Robert, then back at the guards. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what her eyes were seeing. The guards were bowing. To the beggar. To her beggar husband. Robert said nothing, merely nodded to the guards and continued walking through the now open gates. Sarah followed him in stunned shock, her feet moving automatically as her mind struggled to comprehend. Beyond the gates lay gardens. Beautifully maintained gardens with flowers Sarah had never seen before. Ponds with arched bridges, carefully arranged stones. And beyond the gardens, a mansion. Not a house, a mansion, with elegant stonework and brass decorations that gleamed in the afternoon light. The kind of place where important people lived. The kind of place an orphan like her only ever saw from afar. "This," Sarah began, but her voice failed her. She tried again. "This is... your home now," Robert said calmly, still not looking at her, still walking as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Her mind was screaming. None of this made sense. Beggars didn't have mansions. Beggars didn't have guards bowing to them. Beggars didn't have gardens with arched bridges and exotic flowers. But as they approached the mansion, more servants appeared. An entire line of them, all dressed in clean, fine clothes, all bowing deeply as Robert passed. "Welcome home, Mr. Sterling," they chanted in unison. And then, as Sarah passed, still in her shabby and shameful wedding dress, they bowed to her as well. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sterling." Mrs. Sterling. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she stood there, paralyzed, trying to understand how her life had been turned completely upside down in a matter of hours. The beggar everyone despised. The man her aunt had forced her to marry to get rid of her. The human being she had thought represented the absolute rock bottom of her bad luck. Had a mansion. And somehow, in a way she still didn't understand, he commanded the kind of respect that made guards and servants bow. Sarah looked at the man beside her, this stranger who was now her husband, and a single question burned in her mind. Who the hell was Robert, really? And why would a man with all this spend his days sitting in the market dirt pretending to be a beggar? As the mansion door opened and servants led them inside, Sarah realized something with absolute certainty. Her life, which had been so predictable in its misery for so long, was about to become something entirely different, and she had no idea if it would be for better or worse. In the days following the wedding, the reality of her new life began to tighten like a rope around her neck. She woke in an old wooden cottage that creaked with every gust of wind, the smell of damp earth mixed with wood smoke filling her lungs. The mattress was a thin mat on the dirt floor. The walls had holes where she could see the sky through the cracked planks, but what disturbed her wasn't the poverty itself. It was him, the man who had brought her there, who slept beside her as if in a palace, who woke with a tranquil smile while she tried to process what her life had become. He never complained, never showed shame, and that left her utterly bewildered. In the first week, she watched him wake before sunrise, wash his face in a basin of cold water, and head out to the village streets with a dented metal bowl in his hand. He begged. Her husband solicited alms on street corners, sitting cross-legged, his head slightly bowed, as if meditating rather than publicly humiliating himself. And she had to do the same. In the beginning, the shame was unbearable. Every time she extended her hand, every look of pity or disdain she received, every coin tossed with contempt, felt like a stab. She had been raised in a respectable family. She had studied. She had dreams. And now she was there, reduced to begging for scraps. But he never seemed to feel it. Never. When they returned to the shack at the end of the day with a few coins and leftover food that merchants had thrown away, he shared everything with her with a disconcerting serenity. As if that were enough. As if that were normal. "Why aren't you ashamed?" she asked one night, unable to hold the question any longer. He looked at her with those calm, almost amused eyes. "Ashamed of what?" he replied, as if the question made no sense. "This!" She pointed to the empty bowl, to the cracked walls, to the miserable life he had chosen. Of living like this, of begging, of being nothing! He smiled slightly as if she had said something naive. "Do you think what you do defines who you are?" The answer made her even more irritated. He spoke in riddles, always in riddles, as if he were hiding something, or worse, as if he were mocking her. But in the days that followed, she began to notice something strange, something that shouldn't happen to an ordinary beggar. At the market, when they passed by asking for food, there was a fruit vendor who always ignored other beggars. He would shout at them, curse, shoo them away like rats. But when her husband approached, the man would stop. He would look at him, and without saying a word, he would take 2 apples and place them in his bowl, without demanding anything, without expecting payment. She found it strange the first time, a coincidence perhaps, but it happened again and again. Always the same vendor, always the same silent reverence. Another day, as they walked down a busy street, a rich man in expensive clothes passed them. He looked directly at her husband and, for a second, seemed to hesitate. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he bowed his head. It was quick, subtle, but she saw it. A rich man had just bowed to a beggar. She looked at her husband, expecting him to be as surprised as she was. But he just kept walking, as if nothing had happened. "Did you see that?" she asked, incredulous. "See what?" he replied without stopping. "That man. He bowed his head to you." "He must have been polite," he said with a tone too casual to be true. Polite? Rich men don't bow their heads to beggars out of politeness. It didn't make sense, but the mystery continued to deepen. A few weeks later, she discreetly followed him when he went out to beg alone. She wanted to understand. She needed to understand. She stayed far away, watching as he sat in a busy square, the bowl in front of him, his posture erect and serene. And then something happened that chilled her to the bone. A city guard, a man known for his brutality towards beggars, approached him. She braced herself to see her husband being expelled, perhaps assaulted, but the guard stopped. He looked at him for a long moment, and then, to her utter shock, he placed his hand on his chest and bowed deeply. Her husband nodded, a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture. The guard quickly walked away, as if he had just carried out an order. Her heart pounded. This wasn't normal. This couldn't be explained by coincidence or politeness. Something was going on, something he was hiding from her. When he returned home that night, she confronted him. "Who are you?" He raised his eyes from the bowl of rice he was eating, unhurried, unsurprised. "You know who I am," he said calmly. "No, I don't know." "Guards don't bow to beggars. Merchants don't give away food for free. Rich men don't bow their heads in the street. So tell me, who the hell are you?" He stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was amusement. As if he had been waiting for this question for weeks. "Do you really want to know?" he asked, tilting his head. "Yes." He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile. "Then pay closer attention." And with that, he went back to eating, leaving her completely frustrated. He wasn't going to tell her, not yet. But now she knew there was a secret, a big secret, and she was determined to find out. In the following days, she began to observe him differently, no longer with resignation or shame, but with the eyes of an investigator. Every gesture, every interaction, every look he received in the streets, she mentally catalogued. And the more she observed, the more the pieces didn't fit. He never begged for alms like the other beggars. He never pleaded. He never humbled himself. He just sat in silence, and people came to him. Some placed coins, others food, but some just stopped, looked, and walked away with strange expressions, as if they had just seen a ghost. One afternoon, as they were sitting on a street corner, an elderly woman approached. She stared intently at her husband, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. Then, without warning, the woman fell to her knees and began to cry. "Forgive me," the woman whispered, her hands trembling. I didn't know it was you." Her husband gently placed his hand on the woman's shoulder. "Get up," he said softly. "There's nothing to forgive." The woman stood up, still trembling, and ran, disappearing into the crowd. She looked at him, completely stunned. "What was that?" "She mistook me for someone else," he replied, emotionless. "Lie." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. "You're lying." He looked at her, and this time, there was something different in his gaze. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. "You're starting to understand," he said. "Understand what?" "That things aren't always what they seem." She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was his tone of voice, calm but firm. Perhaps it was his gaze, which clearly stated he wouldn't reveal anything before the right time. So she decided to change strategy. If he wouldn't tell her, she would find out herself. She began to follow the clues, to observe who approached him, to listen to whispered conversations when they thought she wasn't paying attention. And slowly, very slowly, a pattern began to emerge. There were people in the village who treated him with fear disguised as respect, others with reverence, and a few with a deep sadness, as if they knew something she didn't. One day, while walking through the market alone, she overheard 2 men talking. "Did you see him today?" One of them said in a low voice. "I did, still in disguise. It's incredible." He really gave up everything. He didn't give up. It was taken from him, but he'll never admit it. She stopped, hidden behind a stall, her heart pounding. They were talking about him. They had to be. And the woman? The first asked. She doesn't know. No one will tell her. He doesn't want them to. How long will he keep this up? Until he decides it's time to return. If he ever returns. Return? Return where? Where did he come from? She left the market almost running, her mind buzzing. Taken from somewhere, disguised, hiding something, waiting for the right moment to return. When she arrived home, he was there, sitting on the floor, mending the strap of a metal bowl. She stopped at the door, watching him. On the outside, he was just a beggar. Torn clothes, dirty hands, disheveled hair. But now she saw beyond that. She saw his upright posture, his unshakable calm, the way he held things with a delicacy that didn't match the life he led. "You're not a real beggar, are you?" she said, her voice low but firm. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw something akin to pride in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "I'm not." Her heart stopped. "Then what are you?" He remained silent for a long moment, as if deciding how much to tell. Then, with a sigh, he stood up and walked towards her. "I was someone important," he said. "But that doesn't matter anymore." "What do you mean it doesn't matter?" "Of course it matters. I married you. I'm living like this because of you." "And you didn't even tell me the truth." "I did tell you," he replied calmly. "I just didn't use words." She stared at him, confused. "Everything you've seen in the past few weeks, all the oddities, all the reverence, all the glances, were the truth. I was just waiting for you to be ready to see." "Ready to see what?" He took a step back, his eyes fixed on hers. "That I'm not who you thought I was. And that this life we're living now isn't the end. It's just the beginning." She felt a shiver run down her spine. The way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, the intensity in his gaze. He wasn't improvising. He had a plan, and she was in the middle of it without knowing. "Then tell me," she demanded. "Tell me everything. Now." He smiled, that enigmatic smile she was already beginning to hate. "Soon," he said. "But first, I need you to trust me." "Trust you? How can I trust someone who hides who they really are?" "Because if you don't trust me," he said, his voice suddenly serious, "when the truth comes out, you won't believe it." And with those words, he left the cabin, leaving her alone with more questions than answers. She stood there, trembling. Not from cold, from anticipation, from fear, from something she couldn't name. Something big was about to happen. She could feel it. And this time, she wasn't just going to watch. She was going to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Because now, for the first time since their marriage, she no longer felt just confusion. She felt curiosity and determination. Determined to discover who the man who had become her husband really was, and why, despite living as a beggar, he was treated like a king in disguise. But she wasn't the type of woman who waited for answers to fall from the sky. Something had changed in her in those days. Confusion gave way to determination. If no one was going to tell her who that man was, she would find out herself. She started with what she had. Observations. Small details that had previously gone unnoticed now gained meaning. The way people averted their gaze when she mentioned the ranch. The sudden silence in conversations when his name came up. That wasn't just respect. It was something bigger. Something everyone knew. Except her. Margaret decided to start at the central square, where merchants sold their goods every morning. There, people talked. There, secrets were currency. She approached a fabric seller, a middle-aged woman with whom she had always exchanged friendly greetings. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Margaret began casually. "I need some advice about the ranch near my property. Do you know the owner?" The woman's expression changed instantly. Her friendly smile froze. Her eyes darted around as if checking who else was listening. "The ranch?" Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "Ah, dear. That place isn't just any place." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson folded a piece of fabric with nervous hands. "All I know is, well, he's an important man. Very important. You'd best not get involved in things you don't understand." And before Margaret could ask more, the woman turned to attend to another customer, ending the conversation abruptly. Margaret left with more questions than answers. But she noticed a pattern, the nervousness, the evasion, the thinly disguised fear. That wasn't normal. She tried with the blacksmith, with the pharmacist, with longtime neighbors. Always the same reaction. Always the same look of, "You shouldn't be asking that." As if she were poking a hornet's nest that everyone knew existed but no one dared to touch. Margaret began to realize it wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was an excess. Everyone knew exactly who he was, and precisely because of that, no one spoke. But Margaret was intelligent. If people wouldn't speak directly, she would observe indirectly. She started paying attention to who visited the ranch, to who left there. And that's when the pattern began to emerge. One day, she saw the district judge leaving the ranch. Not just any lawyer. The judge. The man who decided on lands, disputes, destinies, And he left there with an expression. Respectful. Almost reverent. Days later, it was the sheriff. The town's own sheriff, his star of authority gleaming on his chest, crossing the gates of that ranch as if to report. Not as if making a social visit, as if reporting to a superior. Margaret began to put the pieces together. These weren't casual visits. They were systematic, planned, and the body language of everyone who left there was always the same. Deference, submission, respect. But respect for what? For whom? It was on a Tuesday afternoon that Margaret witnessed something that made her blood run cold. She was returning from town when she saw a group of men on horseback stop at the entrance to the ranch. They seemed agitated, speaking loudly, gesturing with urgency. Then he appeared. The cowboy, walking calmly from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, without haste, without a change in his expression. The men immediately bowed slightly, took off their hats. One of them began to explain something in a hurried, almost pleading voice. He listened in silence. Then he said 2 words. Margaret couldn't hear what they were, but she saw the effect. The men mounted their horses and left immediately, without questioning, without arguing, like soldiers receiving orders from a general. Margaret felt a chill down her spine. That wasn't common influence. That was authority. Real authority, measurable, unquestionable. She needed to know more. That night, Margaret did something she never imagined doing. She waited for the sun to set completely and walked silently to the fence separating her property from the ranch. From there, hidden among the trees, she observed. The main house was lit. Through the windows, she could see movement. Then an elegant carriage arrived. It wasn't a common vehicle. It was luxurious, with crests on the doors. From it descended 3 men dressed in formal attire, carrying leather briefcases. Margaret recognized one of them, the bank president. The most important bank in the region, the man who decided who received credit and who lost everything. And there he was, being received in the house of a cowboy. In the house of a man she saw every day tending horses, mending fences, living an apparently simple life. None of it made sense unless that simple life was a choice, not a condition. Margaret stayed there for almost an hour, observing the comings and goings. More people arrived. Important merchants, landowners, a politician she recognized from newspapers, all entering that house, all with the same expression of respect mixed with anxiety. It was as if the true power of the region gathered there. Not at the city hall, not in the elegant offices of the city, there, at that ranch, under the command of that man she had known covered in mud, mending a fence. When Margaret finally returned home, her hands trembled. Not from fear, from shock, from absolute incomprehension. Who was that man? She spent the entire night awake, replaying every interaction she'd had with him. The kindness, the unshakable calm, the eyes that seemed to see through people. The way he spoke, few words, but each one laden with weight. And she began to remember other details that had seemed insignificant before. How no one ever mentioned problems or conflicts near him. How conversations stopped when he approached. How even rude and violent men lowered their voices in his presence. Margaret had always attributed this to personal respect, natural charisma. Now she realized it wasn't charisma. It was recognition. Recognition of power. But how much power? And of what kind? The next day, Margaret went to town with a specific objective. She sought out Jennifer, the city hall secretary, a gossipy woman who knew everything about everyone. Jennifer, Margaret began, trying to sound casual. Do you know the owner of the ranch near my farm? Jennifer stopped organizing the papers on her desk. She looked at Margaret with a strange expression, half surprised, half cautious. I do, she said slowly. Why? Just curious. He seems different. Jennifer laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Different is an understatement, my dear. That man, well, let's just say he's not just the owner of a ranch. What is he then? Jennifer leaned closer, lowering her voice as if the very walls might be listening. They say nothing happens in this town without him knowing. No important decision is made without his approval. He's not in any official position, but what? But he's the one truly in charge. The mayor, the judge, the guard commander, they all answer to him, one way or another. I don't know if it's out of respect, fear, or debt. Maybe all of it. All I know is that crossing that man is signing your own death warrant. Margaret felt her blood run cold. What do you mean? He doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to threaten. One word from him and doors close. Credit is denied. Licenses disappear. Support evaporates. Nobody knows exactly how he does it, but it happens. It always happens. Margaret left with her mind in a whirlwind. This wasn't just social influence. It was control. Systematic control over the city's mechanisms of power. And suddenly, everything made sense. The way he lived in isolation, yet was never alone. How he received constant visitors, but rarely went into town. How everyone knew who he was, but no one spoke openly about it. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He controlled who was. Margaret returned home in a state of shock. She sat on the porch, looking towards the ranch. From there, she could see smoke rising from the chimney. She could imagine him there, perhaps reading, perhaps tending to the animals, perhaps receiving yet another authority figure who needed his approval to make a decision. And she, naive, thought he was just a gentle cowboy. But the revelation brought more questions than answers. Why would a man with so much power live that way? Why hide behind a facade of simplicity? And most importantly, why had he been so kind to her? She wasn't anyone important. She had no influence. She couldn't offer anything to a man who seemingly already controlled everything. Unless he wanted nothing from her. Unless the kindness was genuine. But that made everything even more confusing. Powerful men weren't known for disinterested kindness. Margaret knew that from experience. Power corrupted. It always corrupted. So what made him different? Margaret spent the following days torn between fascination and caution. Part of her wanted to confront him, to ask directly who he really was. Another part knew that would reveal she was investigating, and something told her that showing her hand too soon would be a mistake. She needed to know more. She needed to understand not just what he was, but why he was that way. And most importantly, she needed to find out if the kindness he had shown was real, or just another tool of a man accustomed to manipulating people and situations. Because if there was one thing Margaret had learned about power, it was that it rarely came without a price, and she needed to know what that price was before getting more deeply involved with that mysterious man. The cowboy who wasn't just a cowboy. The simple man who controlled an entire town. The walking contradiction that challenged everything she thought she knew about power and people. And with every answer she found, bigger questions emerged from the shadows. In the days that followed that discovery, Margaret felt as if she were living two lives at once. By day, she continued her routine as the wife of the most mysterious man in town. By night, her mind spun in endless circles, processing the magnitude of what she had discovered. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He wasn't just a man with connections. No, this was much bigger. The municipal council leader bowed before him like a servant before his king. The question burning in her mind was simple, yet devastating. What do I do now? She had three clear choices. First, confront him directly, demand the truth, and risk destroying everything they had built. Second, feign ignorance, continue living in the comfortable illusion he had created for her. Third, test the limits, observe more, discover how much he truly controlled before revealing what she knew. Margaret chose the third option, because deep down, a part of her needed to understand the full extent of his power before deciding how she felt about it. And it was in this decision that something surprising happened. Margaret began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed, and what she saw changed everything. The first change she noticed was subtle, almost imperceptible. Robert had always been attentive, always kind, but now she perceived a difference in the quality of his attention. He observed her with more intensity, as if trying to read something in her eyes, as if he knew something had changed. Does he know that I know? During breakfast, 3 days after the secret meeting, Robert broke the comfortable silence between them. "You've seemed distant lately," he said, his voice low but laden with genuine concern. "Is everything all right?" Margaret's heart quickened. She forced a smile that she hoped looked natural. "I'm just still processing everything," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "You know, the speed with which my life changed. 6 months ago I was serving drinks at the ranch. Now I'm here, in this incredible house, married to you. Sometimes it still feels unreal." She saw something pass across his face. A shadow of guilt, sadness, understanding. It vanished so quickly that she wasn't sure if it had truly existed. "I understand," he said softly, reaching out to cover hers on the table. "And I want you to know that no matter how unreal it seems, you deserve to be here. You always deserved better than that ranch." The sincerity in his voice almost broke her. Because how could she confront someone who spoke to her like that? How could she accuse a man whose eyes reflected only affection of manipulation? But then she remembered. This same man had enough authority to make the leader of the city council bow before him. This same man controlled things she hadn't even begun to comprehend. The question wasn't whether he was sincere in his affection. The question was, why had he chosen her to direct that affection? In the following days, Margaret began to notice patterns that had completely escaped her before. They went to dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. They didn't have a reservation, but when they arrived, the maitre d' practically tripped over himself to seat them at the best table. The manager personally came to greet Robert, and Margaret noticed the fear disguised as respect in his eyes. She observed the way other customers looked at Robert. It wasn't ordinary admiration. It wasn't the kind of recognition a rich person receives. It was something deeper, more visceral. It was the kind of recognition given to someone who controls your destiny. During dinner, Robert's phone rang 3 times. He politely excused himself and answered each call. Margaret couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Robert's responses were revealing. Proceed as we discussed. No, that project cannot be approved yet. Give them 2 more weeks to reconsider. Good evening. Short answers. Direct commands. The casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When he hung up the 3rd call, Margaret couldn't contain her curiosity. Work never stops, does it? She asked, keeping her tone light. Robert smiled with a touch of weariness. Unfortunately, no. There's always some decision waiting to be made, some problem needing a solution. What kind of decisions? She pressed gently. He studied her for a moment, and Margaret felt as if he was weighing how much to reveal. Most of it is boring, he finally said. Project approvals, resource allocation, conflict mediation, the kind of thing that keeps a city running. A city running, not a company running. Not businesses running. A city. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. He had just confirmed, without realizing it, that his influence extended throughout the entire city. But she forced another smile and changed the subject, storing this revelation to process later. It was 2 days later, during a casual visit to the city center, that Margaret witnessed something that transformed her understanding from assumption into absolute certainty. They were walking through the main square when a group of men in suits approached. Margaret recognized them immediately from the local news. They were members of the city council, business leaders, the chief of police, and all of them bowed slightly when greeting Robert. Sir, the chief of police said, his voice laden with deference, we wanted to inform you personally. The new security initiative is producing excellent results. Crime has dropped 20% since its implementation. His implementation. Not since it was implemented. Not since the council approved it. Since his implementation. Robert nodded, his expression neutral. Excellent. But 20% isn't enough. I want to see 30% by the end of the quarter. Increase patrols in the areas I identified. Yes, sir. It will be done. Margaret watched the exchange in silent shock. The chief of police was taking orders from Robert. Not advice. Not suggestions. Orders. When the group moved away, Robert turned to her with an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. City matters always come up at the most inopportune times. City matters, as if he were, what? The secret mayor? The true power behind the throne? Margaret forced her voice to remain steady. You seem very involved with the city administration. Something changed in his eyes. An assessment? He was measuring how much she had understood, how much she was ready to know. Someone needs to ensure things are done correctly, he said calmly. And I have the resources and knowledge to help. Help. What a delicate word to describe absolute control. But it was that night, when they returned home, that the true magnitude revealed itself. Margaret was in her personal office, a luxurious space Robert had insisted she have, when she decided to do something she knew was risky. She opened her laptop and began to search. She typed, Robert Sterling Urban Development. The results made her freeze. Page after page of articles about development initiatives, social programs, infrastructure reforms, all linked in some way to Robert, but not in the way one would expect. He wasn't listed as a beneficiary. He wasn't mentioned as a primary investor. He was described as a consultant, advisor, anonymous philanthropist who preferred not to be named. But when she dug deeper, using research techniques she had learned in her years on the ranch observing investigative journalists on TV, a pattern emerged. Every major decision made by the city council in the last 10 years had Robert's fingerprints all over it. The new library, funded by a foundation he controlled. The revamped public transport system, designed by a consulting firm he owned. The affordable housing program that lifted hundreds of families out of poverty. His idea, his implementation, his money, and even more disturbing, any project that went against his vision simply died. No matter how popular it was, how necessary it seemed, if Robert didn't approve, it didn't happen. He didn't just control a few aspects of the city. He controlled everything: development, security, the economy, social services. Every important decision passed through him. Every leader answered to him. Robert Sterling was, for all practical purposes, the true ruler of that city. And Margaret, the orphaned girl who served drinks at a dusty ranch, had married him without the slightest idea. She closed the laptop with trembling hands, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. But it was what she discovered next that changed everything. Because when she truly stopped to analyze all those projects, all those initiatives, all those decisions that Robert had made over the years, an undeniable pattern emerged. He wasn't using his power to get rich. He wasn't using his control to oppress. All his decisions, every single intervention had one goal: to improve people's lives. The library he funded, located in the poorest neighborhood, giving access to education to children who would never have a chance otherwise. The transport system, designed specifically to connect low-income areas to employment centers. The housing program, focused on the most vulnerable families, those the traditional system had abandoned. Even the security initiative she had witnessed in the square. When she checked, she found that the increased patrolling was concentrated on protecting the most dangerous neighborhoods, not the wealthiest. Robert had absolute power over the city, and he was using that power to help people, to protect the vulnerable, to uplift the forgotten, to create opportunities where none existed. He was powerful, but he was also good? Margaret felt her world turn upside down once again, because this made everything so much more complicated. It was no longer a simple matter of, he tricked me about who he really is. It wasn't just, he has secrets. It was, he has absolute power, but uses it for good. It was, he controls everything, but with a just purpose. And that led her back to the only question that truly mattered. The question that was consuming her from within. Why me? If he was so powerful, if he controlled an entire city, if he had unlimited resources and unparalleled influence, why choose an orphaned girl from a ranch? Why not marry someone of his own standing? Someone with connections, with status, with power of their own? Why her? Margaret spent the entire night awake, this question echoing in her mind like a constant drum. And it was in the early morning, as the sun began to paint the sky with shades of pink and orange, that she made a decision. She could no longer live with assumptions. She could no longer observe from afar, collecting clues like a detective. She needed the truth, the complete truth, and she needed it directly from Robert. When he came down for breakfast that morning, he found Margaret waiting for him in the dining room. But something in her posture, something in her eyes, made him stop at the entrance. Margaret? His voice carried genuine concern. What happened? She took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice came out firm. We need to talk, Robert. We need to talk for real, without holding anything back, without secrets. She saw something pass across his face. Recognition. As if he knew this moment was coming. As if he had been waiting for it. He closed the door behind him and approached slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. All right, he said softly. Let's talk. Margaret felt tears threaten to overflow, but she forced them back. Not now. She needed to be strong now. I know you're not just a businessman, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I know you have influence over this city. Real influence. Real power. He didn't deny it. He didn't feign surprise. He just nodded slightly, waiting for her to continue. And I've seen what you do with that power, she continued. I've seen the projects, the initiatives, the lives you've changed. I've seen that you are good. That you use all of it to help people. She paused, wiping away a tear that escaped despite her efforts. But the one thing I can't understand, the one thing that's consuming me from within is... Her voice broke, and it took a moment to regain her composure. Why me, Robert? You could have anyone. Someone powerful. Someone with connections. Someone who could truly help you with all of this. So why choose an orphaned girl from a ranch? Why me? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotion. Robert stepped forward, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability, fear, and something even deeper. Because, he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion, of all the people I've met in my entire life, in all the circles of power I've moved in, at all the exclusive events I've attended. He paused, and Margaret saw tears forming in his eyes too. You were the only one who looked at me and didn't see power, didn't see money, didn't see utility. He reached out a hesitant hand, and when she didn't pull back, he gently touched her face. You saw me as just a man who needed coffee and kindness, and for the first time in years, I felt seen as a person, not a tool. Margaret felt her heart clench at the absolute sincerity in his voice. I chose you, Robert continued, his voice now breaking too. Because you are the only real person in a world of masks. Because your kindness isn't calculated. Because when you smile, it's genuine. Because... He paused, and when he continued, his voice was just a whisper. Because I fell in love with who you are, not what you could do for me. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of their beating hearts, by the weight of the truth finally revealed. And then Robert took a step back, his expression changing to something more serious, more somber. But you're right. There are things you don't know. Things I haven't told you because... He hesitated. Because once you know everything, you can't go back. And I feared the full truth would drive you away. Margaret swallowed hard, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. I need to know, she said firmly. I need to know everything. Robert studied her for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. Then you will know. But not here. Not like this. He held out his hand to her. Come with me. There's something I need to show you. A place where it all began. And when you see it, when you understand where I came from and what I built. He paused, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Then you can decide if you still want to stay. Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the choice. This was the moment. She could refuse. She could walk away. She could maintain the safe distance of partial ignorance. Or she could take his hand and dive completely into the truth, no matter how deep or dark it might be. Margaret thought of everything she had discovered. The power, the control, the kindness hidden behind both. She thought of the way he looked at her. The sincerity in his voice when he said he had fallen in love with who she was. She thought of the girl she had been 6 months ago, clearing tables and dreaming of a different life. And she thought of the woman she was becoming now. A woman strong enough to demand the truth, to confront power, to choose her own destiny. She reached out and took his hand. Show me, she said, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. Show me everything. The truth could no longer hide. The air inside that mansion seemed frozen. Catherine stood there, her legs trembling, looking at the man she knew as Thomas, the humble cowboy, the companion for fireside chats, the man who held her calloused hand. But now he stood in the center of a luxurious room, surrounded by rich and influential people, and everyone called him Mr. Sterling. She felt the walls spin around her. Thomas, or whoever you are. Her voice came out shaky. I need you to explain what's happening here, now. He took a step towards her, but Catherine recoiled. No. She raised her hand, stopping his approach. You have no right to come near me now. You lied. From the beginning, you lied. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone present, men in suits, elegant women, even the staff, stood motionless, witnessing the confrontation. Thomas Sterling took a deep breath. You're right, he said softly. I lied, but not about everything. Not about everything? Catherine felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. You pretended to be a cowboy! You let me believe you were poor, that you struggled to survive, that you understood what it was like to have nothing. And it was all a lie. It wasn't a lie. His voice was firm now, more authoritative. I worked as a cowboy because I wanted to. I took care of that ranch because I chose to. And everything I told you about myself, about who I am inside, was true. Catherine shook her head, tears finally escaping. How can I believe you? How can I believe anything you say now? That's when he turned to the people in the room. Leave, all of you. His voice held a tone of absolute command. Now. There was hesitation for a second, just 1 second, before everyone began to move towards the door. In less than a minute, the room was empty. Only Catherine and he remained. She stared at him, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Who are you, really? He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. When he opened them again, there was something different in them. A raw vulnerability she had never seen before. My full name is Thomas Sterling. I am the main investor and patron of this city. My family built half the schools, hospitals, roads. When the orphanage where you grew up almost closed 12 years ago due to lack of funds, it was my money that kept it open. Catherine felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. What? I never told you because it wasn't about that. It wasn't about what I did for the orphanage. It was about who you became despite the orphanage. He took another step towards her, and this time, Catherine didn't back away. 3 years ago, I was tired. Tired of being treated like a walking ATM. Tired of women who smiled at me because they saw dollar signs, not a person. Tired of friends who only showed up when they needed favors. I was empty. His voice trembled slightly. So I ran away. I bought that ranch in the middle of nowhere. Put on simple clothes, got my hands dirty, and pretended to be an ordinary man. And for the first time in years, I could breathe. Catherine watched him in silence, tears still streaming down her face. That's when you appeared, he continued, looking for work, willing to do anything honest to survive. And I watched you. I saw how you treated animals with kindness, how you shared your food with stray dogs, how you never complained, even when the work was hard, how you laughed even carrying so much pain on your shoulders. He stopped right in front of her now, so close she could see the tears in his eyes too. And then one day, I heard you talking to yourself while cleaning the stables. You said, it doesn't matter what they think of me. I know who I am, and that has to be enough. And in that moment, Catherine, I knew. Knew what? She could barely speak. That you were real. That in a world full of masks and lies, you were the only genuinely true person I had ever met. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't pretending to be something you weren't. You simply existed. Authentic, strong, beautifully imperfect. Catherine felt a sob escape. You tricked me. I tricked you, he admitted, but not about my feelings. Every conversation we had, every laugh, every moment I held your hand, All of it was real. More real than anything I've lived in the last 10 years. He slowly raised his hand, giving her time to refuse, and gently touched her face, wiping away a tear. Do you know why I chose you? Why, of all the people I've met, you were the only one who made me want to reveal who I truly am. Catherine shook her head, unable to speak. Because everyone in this city judges me by what I have, my possessions, my influence, my power. But you judge me by what I did, by how I treated people. By the honesty in my words. You saw value in a man who thought he was just a cowboy. He smiled through his tears. And if you could see value in someone who believed they were poor and simple, imagine what that says about your character. You don't love for interest, you love for essence. Catherine closed her eyes, trying to process it all. But I'm nobody. I have no family, no prestigious last name, no refined education. I grew up in an orphanage, Thomas. Sterling, whoever you are. I am literally the last person someone like you should choose. That's when he pulled her closer, holding her shoulders firmly. Catherine, listen to what I'm about to tell you now, and listen carefully. She opened her eyes, meeting his intense gaze. That shame you feel for growing up in the orphanage? That feeling of being lesser than others? That thing people used to diminish you your whole life? He squeezed her shoulders gently. That's exactly what made you worthy. Catherine blinked, confused. What? You grew up with nothing, but you never let that make you cruel. You were rejected, but you never learned to reject others. You suffered humiliation, but you never used it as an excuse to humiliate those beneath you. Your suffering made you compassionate, not bitter. It made you strong, not fragile. It made you real, not superficial. His voice was laden with emotion now. While the rich women of this city learned to manipulate, you learned to survive with honesty. While they learned to use people, you learned to value them. While they worried about keeping up appearances, you worried about maintaining your integrity. He placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. Your history as an orphan is not your shame, Catherine. It is your glory. It is living proof that character doesn't come from a golden cradle. It comes from choices. And every day of your life, you chose to be decent, even when life wasn't decent to you. Catherine felt something breaking inside her. Not from pain, but from liberation. As if invisible chains she had carried for years were finally shattering. You chose me. Because I'm an orphan? I chose you despite the world telling you that made you less. I chose you because it made you more. And then, for the first time since she had entered that mansion, Catherine felt no shame. She didn't feel small or unworthy. She felt something she had never felt before in her life. She felt she was enough. But what now? She asked with a trembling voice. What happens now? You are practically the owner of this city. And I am. You are the woman I love, he interrupted. And if you accept me, not as Thomas the cowboy, not as Sterling the patron, but as the flawed man I am beneath it all, then what happens now is that we write our own story. Catherine stared at him for a long moment. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes. She saw the fear of rejection, the same fear she had carried since childhood. She saw a man who had everything money could buy, but who stood there, trembling, waiting for a nameless orphan to give him the one thing money couldn't buy: true acceptance. I need time, she said finally. I need to process all of this. He nodded immediately. All the time you need. And I need to know, Catherine continued, her voice growing firmer, that if I say yes, if I choose to stay, it won't be as your property, not as someone you saved, but as your equal. Sterling smiled, that genuine smile she had learned to recognize during their nights around the campfire. Catherine, you have always been my equal. In fact, in many ways, you have always been better than me. She took a deep breath, feeling the magnitude of that moment. Then give me 3 days. 3 days to decide if I can trust you again. If I can believe that the man I met at the ranch is the same man standing in front of me now. 3 days, he agreed. And Catherine, yes? Regardless of your decision, you need to know one thing. From this moment on, you are no longer invisible in this city. You are no longer the orphan no one notices. You are the woman who captured the heart of the most powerful man in the region. And even if you reject me, even if you never want to see me again, that won't change. He stepped back, walking towards the door. Your worth never depended on me, Catherine. But perhaps I need you to remember my own worth too. And with that, he left the room, leaving Catherine there, alone in the middle of that luxurious mansion. But for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small in a large space. She felt exactly the right size. Outside, through the enormous windows, the city stretched out under the afternoon sun. That same city that had ignored her for so long. That same city that had made her feel invisible. Catherine looked at her own reflection in the glass. She saw the same simple girl as always. The same modest clothes. The same calloused hands from work. The same makeup-free face. But something was different now. Her gaze was different. For the first time, when she looked at herself, Catherine didn't see an orphan. She didn't see someone worthless. She didn't see someone who needed to apologize for existing. She saw a woman who had survived, a woman who had kept her humanity intact even when the world tried to tear it from her, a woman who had been chosen not despite her history, but because of it. And most importantly, she saw a woman with a choice, because that's what Sterling had given her, not wealth, not status, not salvation. He had given her the power to choose. She could choose to forgive him for the lie, or not. She could choose to believe in him again, or not. She could choose to build a life beside him, or not. For the first time, Catherine wasn't reacting to life. She was directing it. And that feeling of autonomy, of personal power, of agency over her own destiny, was more intoxicating than any mansion, any wealth, any title he could offer. Catherine touched the cold window with her fingertips. 3 days, she whispered to her reflection. I have 3 days to decide who I want to be. Not who others expected her to be. Not who society said she should be. Not the grateful orphan being saved by the rich man. But who she, Catherine, would choose to be. And outside, unbeknownst to her, Sterling leaned against the corridor wall, eyes closed, hands trembling. He had built an empire. He had moved mountains. He had changed the destiny of thousands of people with a single signature. But never in his life had he felt so much fear, because everything he built could be rebuilt. All the money he lost could be recovered. Every failed business could be redone. But she was irreplaceable. And now, after years of controlling everything around him, he had finally found something he couldn't control, her heart. He could only hope that the truth, raw, vulnerable, imperfect, would be enough. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered, if you lose her, you haven't lost a woman. You've lost the only person who saw you as human. 3 days, 72 hours, 4,320 minutes, to find out if belated honesty still held any value. To find out if love built on half-truths could transform into something entirely real. To find out if an orphan and a patron could rewrite the rules of an entire city. And as the sun began to set over that city, 2 people separated by walls, but connected by something much deeper, faced the same daunting question. The truth hurts, but does the truth also heal? In 3 days, they would have the answer, and the entire city would be watching. And so, with her heart still racing from the weight of her choice, she took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. She would no longer be the young woman who accepted silence as refuge. She would no longer be the one who hid in the shadows of humiliation. She had made her decision, and that decision would change everything. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was a mix of hope and trust there, as if he knew, deep down, that she would make the right choice. And she did. With a firm voice, without hesitation, she said, I accept, but not because you offered me a crown. I accept because I recognize within myself the strength that has always been here. And that strength was not given to me by you. It was always mine. The words echoed through the hall like silent thunder. Those who moments before judged her, who laughed at her, who saw her as insignificant, now watched her with a different expression. It was respect. It was admiration. It was the recognition that this woman was not who they thought she was. She took a step forward, not as someone asking for permission, but as someone claiming her place. And in that moment, something in the air shifted. The energy of the hall transformed. The people who had previously whispered and mocked now bowed slightly, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. She turned to the crowd. Her gaze swept over every face, every expression. And then, with a calm that came from a deep place within her, she began to speak. You saw me arrive here today and wondered who I was. Some of you laughed. Others scorned me. And some even questioned if I deserved to be here. But I am here. And not because someone gave me permission. I am here because I have survived things that many of you will never imagine. She paused, letting the words penetrate the hearts of those present. I grew up without a family. I grew up being called nothing. I grew up hearing that my place was in the shadows. But do you know what I learned? I learned that a person's worth is not in where they were born, or who raised them, or how much wealth they possess. A person's worth is in their ability to stand up when the whole world pushes them down. The silence was absolute. No one dared to interrupt her. She had captured everyone's attention, not with shouts or arrogance, but with the pure, raw truth of her experience. Today, I did not come here seeking validation from anyone. I did not come here to prove I am worthy. I came here because someone saw in me what it took me years to see in myself. And now I see it. I see my strength. I see my resilience. I see my worth. And if you cannot see it, the problem is not mine. It is yours. And then, something surprising happened. One of the women who had mocked her the most at the beginning, a noble woman with an haughty posture and a judgmental gaze, stepped forward. Her eyes were brimming with tears. She knelt before her and said, her voice choked, "Forgive me. I judged you without knowing you. I scorned you without knowing your story. I was wrong. The young woman extended her hand and helped the woman to her feet. Rise, you do not need to kneel before me. We only need to see each other as equals. We all have battles. We all have scars. The difference lies in how we choose to use those experiences. Others began to approach, one by one. Those who had judged her, who had scorned her, who had laughed at her, now came closer with expressions of regret and admiration. She did not reject them. She did not humiliate them. She received them with grace, with compassion, with the wisdom of one who understands that true strength is not in crushing others, but in lifting them up. And there, in that moment, something magical happened. The transformation was not just hers, it was everyone's. The entire hall transformed into a space of reflection, of recognition, of humanity. He watched everything from afar, with a discreet smile on his lips. He had chosen well. Not just a woman of beauty or intelligence. He had chosen someone with the ability to transform not only herself, but everyone around her. She turned to him, and they looked at each other. Not as prince and servant, not as noble and commoner, but as partners, as equals, as two souls who recognized something rare and precious in each other. Did you know this would happen? She asked with a playful smile. I had hoped, he replied. But you surpassed all my expectations. And so, side by side, they walked together through the hall. Not as lord and servant, but as two individuals who chose to walk together, respecting each other's strength and worth. In the days that followed, she did not just assume her new role. She redefined it. She began to use her position to help those who, like her, were invisible. Those who were scorned. Those who had no voice. She created spaces where marginalized people could learn, grow, develop. She opened doors that had previously been closed. She gave hope where before there had only been despair. And every day her influence grew, not because she had a title, not because she had wealth, but because she had something that no title or wealth could buy. Authenticity, compassion, and the courage to use her own pain to heal others. People began to seek her out, not just from the nobility, but from all corners of the kingdom. They came seeking advice, guidance, hope. And she always had time for them. She always listened. She always cared. One day, a young orphan approached her, her eyes full of tears and her voice trembling. People say I'm nothing, that I will never be anything. How did you do it? How did you overcome it? She knelt before the girl, gently holding her hands. I succeeded because I stopped believing what others said about me, and started believing what I knew about myself. I knew I was strong. I knew I was resilient. I knew I had worth. And so do you. Never let anyone's words erase the truth that lives within you. The girl hugged her tightly, and she returned the embrace. It was a full circle. She, who was once the invisible girl, was now the voice others needed to hear. And as the sun set over the kingdom, she stood high on the balcony, gazing at the horizon. She thought of all she had been through. The nights of hunger, the cruel words, the deep loneliness. And she thought of where she was now. He approached, standing beside her. What are you thinking about? He asked. I'm thinking I never imagined my life could be like this. I'm thinking that all the pain, all the struggles, all the tears, they brought me here. And if I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. Because every scar, every wound, every challenge shaped me into the person I am today. He smiled. And you are amazing. We are amazing, she corrected. Because you had the wisdom to see beyond appearances. You saw what truly matters. And that in itself is rare. They stood there in silence, watching the sunset. And in that moment of peace, a truth crystallized. A truth that would echo for generations. A person's true worth is never in their appearance, their birth, or their social position. True worth lies in the strength of their character, the resilience of their spirit, and the ability to rise no matter how many times the world tries to knock them down. And this truth, simple and powerful, is what transforms lives. It's what transforms communities. It's what transforms the world. Because in the end, we all carry scars. We all face battles. And we all have the choice to let these experiences destroy us or define us. She chose to be defined by her strength, not by her pain. And that choice made all the difference. So, as you watch this story, I ask you, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever felt like no one saw your true worth? If so, you are not alone. All of us at some point go through this. But here's the truth. The judgment of others does not define who you are. Only you can define that. And when you choose to believe in your own strength, when you choose to stand up despite the circumstances, when you choose to use your pain as fuel to help others, you become unstoppable. Share in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where you had to prove your worth? How did you overcome it? Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear exactly what you have to say. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that you are stronger than you think, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because here, we share stories that go beyond entertainment. We share truths that transform lives. And as the sun sets on this story, remember, you are not defined by where you started. You are defined by who you choose to become. And that choice, that powerful choice, always has been and always will be yours. Until the next story.